On a warm, sunny Sunday in late November, just before Thanksgiving holiday, I was fishing a hole about 1 mile up from Bogue Inlet. Bogue Inlet is a beautiful region of the Bogue Banks, east-west running barrier beach at the most southern reaches of the Outer Banks in North Carolina. It's a nice hole. I'd say a 6 to 7 man hole at best. No funny stuff, just an opening in the sandbar and closed on both sides like a horseshoe. It had been a productive hole throughout the summer. Black drum, red drum, and the like, Spanish mackerel, blues, a good hole. Now, along with the rest, speckled trout. It's fall, you know, almost Thanksgiving. I've been fishing there up and down the beach most of the morning, plugging with trout with mirror lures and grubs, the usual. Late in the morning, a family, actually two, in two 4x4 pickup trucks, drove up and joined me. One of the men walks over and say, "How you doing? I'm Mike. I work over at Bogue Field." It's the air base, of course. That's a few miles away, right over on the mainland there. Well, we exchanged pleasantries. He explained me how he was there with his wife and his friend's wife, and of course, Grandpa. They come here a lot. We then each boasted how this hole had produced drum, trout for each of us, and so on. And we went on our ways. I plugged, they rigged. We spent the pleasantries of the afternoon occasionally communicating in nonverbal gestures. One thing you must never do when surf casting, and underscore never, by the way, never do is surf casting, is take your eyes off the surf. Don't get distracted, even for a moment, and never, never, never turn your back. And all of a sudden, crash, man down, was the cry. Well, Mike had done the unthinkable. He had turned his head or back or something. Anyway, he went from fishing to the fine art of swimming in waders in an instant. Sand in his reel, 50-degree water trickling down his boots to his toes of those waders. The reaction was immediate. Fighting the surf for control of the beach and body, emerged the water unaided. In an attempt to cover his embarrassment, Mike instantaneously lashed out a blue streak of profanity that should have been, in a very perfect world, cleared the sand from his reel, dried the cold, salty water from his waders, and reestablished his rightful position in the universe. Well, it didn't work. Mike, dripping and cursing, friends and family hiding their smiles, he retreated to the cover of the passenger side of his pickup truck. Stripped in defeat to what undergarments had remained dry, not many I might add, and garbed himself in some fresh, dry attire. He now rejoined the rest of us, his wife, his friends, and of course Grandpa, to face the music as it were. But this story is about Grandpa. Mike's grandpa, a man of 82 years, had been fishing these parts, Bogue Banks, for the better part of the century. It's the fall, and Grandpa knows trout. So he was there just like he had been there the year before that, and so on. Grandpa was dressed for trout with his hip-hugging boots hooked at the waist, several layers of plaid flannel shirts, and a cap that he fished with him for the better part of the century as well. Grandpa had one, maybe two rods, one sand spike, and his sand chair, and a pile of cut shrimp, 2, 3, maybe 4 pieces per shrimp if they were big. He was ready for an afternoon of trouting. Once Grandpa baited his hook, he would place his rod over his right shoulder, walk slowly down the beach, and on the outgoing wave, measuring its retreat with the precision of Acapulco cliff divers, he proceeded to cast the shrimp with his accompanying 3-ounce lead weight with a snap of his wrist, turn back, now the incoming wave, and with the earned confidence of his 82 years, placed the rod over his back, over his right shoulder, retreated back up the sandy slope, cranking his reel in reverse. Once he reached his destination, he turned gently, if not gracefully, lowered himself into the chair, and placed his rod across his lap, assumed the trouting position. Grandpa would, from time to time, when he would choose, when it was right, slowly retrieve his line, crank, back up the sandy slope, crank, sinker in the toe, crank, scratching a thin line up the sand right up to his feet. He would check the bait for damage and replace it if necessary. Then carefully, if not gradually, if not gracefully, get up, walk back to water's edge, on the outgoing wave, cast, turn, and retreat to his chair just as precisely as he had done before. This was on much of an afternoon This went on much of the afternoon, with me and my plug-in, Mike and the others chunking lead, occasional black drum or such, when almost unnoticed, Grandpa's rod became alive. Grandpa, just as before, started to crank, 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 then slowly one more crank, then another, and so on. Finally, someone, Mike's wife, I think, said, "Grandpa's got a fish." Well, maybe a pinfish or a drum or something, but now Gramps been cranking long enough, we could tell that it was a trout. Beautifully silvered, black speckles, 2, maybe 3 pounds. No match for Grandpa. Somebody, Mike's wife or someone else, yelled, "Get the net!" Get the net, I thought. Well, luckily Gramps ignored the commotion and kept cranking. With Grandpa fully in control, he'd done this 1,000 times before. You know, the fish now emerged from the surf, up to the hard, wet sand on the beach, up towards his chair, and with the efficiency of a dedicated flock of hungry gulls, ready to poke the fish's eyes out, the rest of the entourage descended upon the fish, plucked it off the hook, placed the trout in the cooler, in the back of the pickup, and each in turn patted Grandpa on the head in recognition of his triumph. Well, Grandpa, without looking up, sighed oh so slightly in acknowledgement. He rebaited his hook, walked back down the sandy slope, measuring the retreating wave just as precisely as he had done before. He cast his fresh piece of shrimp and a 3-ounce sinker back into the hole, right along the west edge of the hole, turned, placing his rod over his shoulder, back cranking the reel. He returned to his chair, put his reel on his lap. Looking seaward, he continued trouting. You know, Grandpa knows trout.